everyone, and welcome to this presentation, Women Religious and the Transformation of Theological Education. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Margaret Eletta Guider, OSF, otherwise known as Meg, is Associate Professor of Missiology here at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. Working in the area of systematic theology, her teaching and research interests focus primarily on ecclesiology and missiology. She is a member of the Sisters of St. Francis of Mary Immaculate of Joliet, Illinois. Born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, she completed undergraduate and graduate studies in education at the University of Illinois and taught in both public and parochial schools of the inner city. In 1975, she became a lay missioner and ministered in the rural interior of Brazil with the Sisters of St. Francis of Mary Immaculate. Upon her return to the United States, she entered the congregation, and after her period of formation, she returned to Chicago and served as Director of Mission Education for the Archdiocese and as chaplain for the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center. These experiences informed and influenced her ongoing commitment to Franciscan life, her interest in mission and the world church, and her passion for theology and ministerial formation. Sister Guider holds theological degrees from Catholic Theological Union, the Weston Jesuit School of Theology, and the Harvard Divinity School. Currently, she is working on a book-length manuscript entitled With Hearts Broken Open, U.S. Franciscan Missionaries in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa, 1879 to 2009. She is the former president of the Association of Professors of Mission, as well as the American Society of Missiology. She has served as an advisor and consultant for religious institutes and missionary societies, as well as a board member for a variety of Catholic institutions and organizations. And she is a wonderful person, a wonderful religious, a wonderful colleague, and a wonderful citizen of the School of Theology and Ministry. And we're delighted to have one of our own close out our spring 2023 continuing education lecture series. Will you join me in welcoming Sister Guider to speak about women religious and the transformation of theological education?
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for being here this evening. It's my pleasure to see all of you and to proceed. So I will pour out my spirit, and your daughters shall prophesy. Roman Catholic Women Religious and the Transformation of Theological Education in the United States. So at the outset of my presentation this evening, I would like to begin with dedications to two of my deceased colleagues, Professor Francine Cardman, in whose honor this lecture series was inaugurated, and to Father Thomas Stegman, who as Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry, envisioned and established the Women in Theology and Ministry lecture as an annual event here at Boston College. So, my objective in today's lecture is to reflect upon the contributions that women, Roman Catholic women religious in the United States have made and continue to make to theology and theological education through their efforts in various disciplines of biblical, historical, theological, ethical, and pastoral studies, canon law, and the arts of human, ministerial, and spiritual formation. I'd like to just frame this. When we talk about women religious as theologians and theological educators, I want us to consider these terms, theologians and theological educators, as umbrella categories for those engaged in any of the disciplines, fields of research, professions, and ministerial arts that are part of the endeavors known as theology and theological education. So, with regard to contributions, I want to highlight the lives and legacies of the women of whom I'm speaking collectively. So you're not going to hear a lot of names. And I'm doing this intentionally because I want to focus more on contributions than individual contributors. In tracing some of the events and exigencies that led, at least in part, to the emergence of their prophetic voices and visions, I hope to demonstrate the significance of their ever-widening circles of influences locally, nationally, and internationally. So here you can see just some of the contributions which I will break out in the second half of my lecture. So given the time allotted, I have divided the lecture into two parts. The first part I call the BMW, before Sister Madeleva Wolf, and the second part, AMW, after Sister Madeleva Wolf. My hope is that by heightening historical consciousness and identifying some of the ways in which the interactive dynamics of past, present, and future converge, we may be able to see, as if for the first time, the transformative action of the Holy Spirit made manifest in and through the witness and contributions of women religious to the transformation of theological education. Some of these women have gone before us in faith. Others are alive and well, and some are sitting in this room and on Zoom right now. Many of them you may be able to call to mind, having known them in person as your teachers, your mentors, colleagues, or administrators, and others may be known through their writings, recorded presentations, or reputations. Or perhaps along the way, you may have acquired some measure of their wisdom and knowledge in a mediated way, thanks to someone who came under their influence at some point in time. So, I'd like to pose a question to you. This will be a bit of an interactive proceeding. So I want to ask the question, who are the women religious who informed, influenced, and transformed your theological imagination or your theological education? Let's just take a minute or two for you to talk to the person next to you. All right, I'm going to bring you back to the group. Given that vibrant and enthusiastic exchange, we must be talking about some people that are very significant and important to you. So, making connections between the daughters who prophesied in the past and those who are doing so today. In the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, verse 17, we hear the Apostle Peter addressing in a loud voice the amazed and astonished crowd that is trying to make meaning of what they have just witnessed as a consequence of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on those who were gathered in the upper room on the day of Pentecost. As we read in Acts chapter 1, verses 13 to 14, those gathered included Peter, John, James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James, Simon, and Jude, along with several unnamed women, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and his cousins. As evidenced in Giotto's depiction of the event, there is no wide-angle view capturing the image of all those present. Yet such representation need not be missing from our own theological imaginations when, thanks to Photoshop, we can fill in the spaces with a few additional images of at least a few of the several unnamed women. As Peter endeavors to enlighten the they must be drunk interpreters, he proclaims to the crowd that the words of the prophet Joel are being fulfilled before their very eyes. God's Spirit has been poured out on all humankind, and their sons and their daughters are prophesying. We can only wonder how those men, and most likely women and children as well, were astounded as they heard not only the voices of the apostles, but perhaps the voices of Mary and the unnamed women preaching to them, and in their own languages, of the marvels of God, a new Magnificat. So, part one, BMW. From Pentecost to 1943. While Mary and the unnamed women of Pentecost provide a foundation for all women who, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, have given voice to the wonders and mystery of God's and God's action in the world, a quick overview of several centuries of the history of Christianity reveals to us the ways in which other women, also inspired by the Holy Spirit, followed their lead. In fact, we wouldn't be here today reflecting on the contributions of women religious to theology and theological education had it not been for the collective legacy of particular women who, as Cenobitic women, monastic nuns, women tertiaries, reformers, visionaries, protagonists, and foundresses, and all of those who today fall under the category of women religious, active and contemplative, who have contributed in a variety of ways to the flourishing of theology, spirituality, and ministry over the course of centuries. To gain some historical perspective, we do well to remember Melania, the elder, Macrina, the younger, the Cappadocian mother in her own right, Syncletica, and other desert mothers. Moving on to abbesses, mystics, tertiaries, and reformers, we begin to see patterns of incredible creativity in the person of Hildegard of Bingen, the vision and spiritual influence of Angela Foligno, the tenacity and wisdom in the person of Catherine of Siena, and righteous indignation in the person of Teresa of Avila. We also see the emergence and appropriation of spiritual charisms of Benedictines, Franciscans, Dominicans, and Carmelites in the wake of the Counter-Reformation, the Age of Exploration, the colonial expansion of empires, and the emergence of institutes of apostolic life and missionary societies. We see how the contours of religious life for women were shaped anew by theology, spirituality, and mission, as well as religious persecution, suppression, revolution, exile, and migration. Charisms attributed to the Holy Spirit, working in and through the lives of foundresses and their early companions, became manifestations of the prophetic voices and visions of women religious whose untiring energies enabled them to stand their ground in the face of exclusion, impoverishment, defamation, violence, at the hands of social, political, cultural, and economic forces, as well at times the malevolence of ecclesiastical authorities, whose misogyny and reckless abuse of power, like the vizier Balaam from the book of Numbers, prevented them from seeing. So, however similar to the Shias, mistreated, maligned, and misunderstood by the seer who could not see, these women and those who would follow them in the future found their voices and their visions and their vindication as they dared to raise profoundly theological questions and have echoed through history. and to a particular context that we have come to know as the United States of America, and to the key question, what were the contextual exigencies and ecclesial events that led women religious in this context to become contributors to theology and theological education? So, an exigency. Women religious and the apostolic priority of educating girls and women coming to terms with deficits in an adequate theological formation for their own sisters, those entrusted to their care. Highlights in the history of Catholic education in the United States reveal that unlike Canada or Mexico, it was not until the American Revolution that the freedom of religion created new pathways for Catholic education. During the 1800s, given the exponential growth of parochial grade schools, the establishment of single-sex high schools and academies for girls and young women, the emergence of professional schools for nurses, teachers, and secretaries, and the evolution of academies into junior colleges and eventually four-year liberal arts colleges, women religious created an extraordinary educational network paralleled only by what they created in healthcare and social services. In the decades of the early 20th century, as vocations to religious life in the United States were on the rise, congregations entrusted with the faith formation of children and young women within their educational institutions recognized that more than catechesis, what was needed in their academies and colleges, and more than catechesis and spiritual reading at meals, was needed for the religious and theological formation of their own sisters. Women religious, in a manner similar to the historical examples noted earlier, found ways of getting around the hard and fast rules that denied them access to formal theological education. Brothers, uncles, cousins, and confessors, and in some case, men religious with whom they shared a common charism, served as tutors, mentors. They could not offer them diplomas or places at the table, but informally, they could give them backdoor access to knowledge. They could provide them with manuscripts, books, their own notes, their own writings. They could teach them ancient languages. And more importantly, they could encourage these women religious to write their own theological thoughts, scriptural commentaries, and spiritual reflections. However, such strategies were stopgap measures, not long-term solutions. So, the adaptation to life. Make use of what the secular university has to offer. Learn the basics and bring to them your own added value as a woman religious. Draw inspiration from women religious throughout church history who made a way when there was no way. Remember, exclusion and access denied are not unprecedented experiences. So, for example, you want to study scripture or patristics. Well, pursue a degree in classical languages or philosophy at a secular university, but focus on biblical literature, Augustine, or history of the Greco-Roman world. So you want to study moral theology or ethics? Well, pursue a degree in philosophy at a secular university. Study Aristotle, Aquinas, existentialism, personalism. So you want to study church history? Pursue a degree in European history and pick a country and a period. Focus on monasticism, Counter-Reformation, the Age of Empire, and missionary activity. So you want to study spirituality or perhaps homiletics? Well, pursue a degree in Spanish literature, English literature, German literature, French literature, Italian literature. focus on the mystics and the preachers. So you want to study liturgy, religious art, and music? Well, pursue a doctorate in fine arts. Pick your period and stick to it. If you already have a doctorate in another field of study, you know what to do. Teach yourself. A PhD is a PhD. Enter Sister Madeleva Wolf. In 1943, Sister Madeleva Wolf came up with another solution. She was president of St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, and founded the School of Sacred Theology. Madeleva's primary concern in establishing the school had been a practical one, to ensure adequate preparation for those actually teaching theology in the Catholic school system, most of whom were nuns. By the time of the school's 10th anniversary, enrollment averaged 20 and 30 students during the academic year and more than 100 during the summer session. With nearly 3 million U.S. Catholic children in Catholic elementary schools, 500,000 students in Catholic high schools, and 100,000 Catholic students in Catholic women's colleges, Gail Mendels highlights the comment of Bishop Edwin O'Hara in his speech on the occasion. How overwhelming the demand for the advance of religious education on the part of teachers in our Catholic schools. How many times the facilities of the St. Mary's School of Theology must be multiplied if this need is to be met. As Tom Fox observes, Wolf's story reveals the ingenuity, persistence, and vision of a pioneering nun. In 1954, it's interesting to note that the Vatican modeled its own graduate school of theology for women, Regina Mundi, after St. Mary's. As existing graduate theology programs in the United States began to accept women as students, St. Mary's began to phase out the school before it closed in 1970. At that time, the School of Sacred Theology had granted 76 doctoral and 354 master's degrees to both religious women as well as lay women, as well as several lay men. Before proceeding, it might be helpful to just get a sense of these statistics. Not everybody may be able to see, but what this offers us is some sense of the rapid growth. 1730, we have 14 sisters. 1840, we're up to 900. 1900, we're up to 50,000. 1930, 135,000. 1965, 180,000. 1970, we're dropping down to 161,000. 1975, 135. I'll just stop there for now. But you see, between 1900 and 1965, the urgency of theological formation for women. So, an event. Focus on charisms and see what happens. In the aftermath of World War II, religious charisms became a focus of theological discussion and debate. In 1950, Arcadio Laronia Saralugai, Claretian, then Secretary of the Congregation for Religious, spoke to general superiors from around the world who were convoked by Pope Pius XII to attend the First General Congress of the States of Perfection held in Rome. He highlighted two specific dynamics of spiritual renewal. Aggiornamento was one, openness to new ways of thinking, and charism was the other. His exhortation to religious leaders and their institutes was straightforward. And here, I think, is a significant turning point for women religious. Return to your origins, rediscover the charisms of your founders and foundresses, allow yourself to be transformed by the question, how is the Spirit at work within your institute today, do not concern yourselves with what your founder or foundress did in past times. Consider rather what he or she would do today if they were alive and active. And the final one, we must live in our times and according to the needs of our times. In the early 1950s, ecclesial forces in Rome called together the general superiors of women religious from around the world. And this ecclesial call to recover their roots, discover, uncover, was important. Similar to other countries, major superiors in the United States came together in 1956. I'll say a little bit more about that later, to establish the National Conference of Major Superiors of Women. Out of this emerged a focus on formation and professional preparation for incoming women religious. So, whether as a consequence or coincidence, men religious became attentive to the gifts and talents of their sisters who shared their charism, and whether by desire or coercion, created institutes and programs of study designed to provide at least some of their sisters with access and opportunities for theological education that previously were reserved to men religious, especially those who were ordained. But this was happening largely informally. So, an exigency. Called to the ministries of spiritual and religious formation of young women, what to do? Well, you can follow Sister Madeleva's lead. Establish at your college or mother house an institute, and if necessary, appeal to your brothers who share the same or a similar charism for accompaniment and partnership in this ministry. And if you are a Franciscan, call it a seraphic institute. A great cover for teaching the Franciscan intellectual tradition, philosophy and theology, not only Franciscan spirituality. It was also a way to identify those who have a gift for doing theology. More than an event, Vatican II, the third and fourth sessions, brought in women religious. But before proceeding to this discussion, let me pose 4 questions. And I'm only going to ask you to answer one of them, but I want you to see what all 4 are. Identify one thing that has happened in the United States from the time of Vatican II until recent years that would be of concern for women religious who are theologians and theological educators. Identify one thing that has happened in the church, locally, nationally, and internationally from the time of Vatican II until recent years that would be of concern for women religious who are theologians and theological educators. One thing do you think women religious who are theologians and theological educators should make a subject of their concern today on April 27th? So turn to the person next to you and answer the question. All right, I'm going to cut you off from your conversations. I'm sure there's a lot of good answers. Thoughts? But I want to focus on some events and exigencies that I think also generated interest, not only need for theological study, but also interest. Sister Maria Augusta-Neil's Sisters Study is one thing that comes to mind. She amassed a massive quantity of data, but if you'll notice, highlighted in yellow, one of those things was individual beliefs concerning theology and religious life. She had an incredible response to this survey, and the opinions of the sisters and their current state in their life in community continues to be a subject of interest, even now as everything has been digitized. Some other events and exigencies would be the post-conciliar general chapters, the implementation of Perfecti Caritatis and Renovationis Causam, and the other documents of the Second Vatican Council. More events and exigencies include the evolution of the Conference of Major Superiors of Women, founded in 1956. In 1971, the evolution involved a separation or a multiplication, however you want to interpret it. In 1971, new bylaws and changes to the name of the organization to the Leadership Conference of Women Religious went forward. However, not all of the sisters went forward. Some chose to move toward the Consortium Perfecti Caritatis. And here we see the tension emerging after the Second Vatican Council within the lives of women religious. Not unconnected to this reality was other events and exigencies that occurred, namely in the apostolic visitation of U.S. women religious from 2008, 2009 to 2012, and then the subsequent Vatican investigation of the leadership of Conference of Women Religious from 2009 to 2015. Now, it's important to make connections here because part of the investigation of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious was directly related to women theologians, both religious and lay women, who had been significant influencers in the conference. It's also important to know that many of the leaders, the elected leaders and appointed leaders of these religious congregations were also theologically trained. Among them, spectacular canon lawyers. So looking at the contributions, women religious as theologians and scholars, women religious as theologians and institutional leaders, women religious as theological educators, women religious, theologians and theological educators as advocates for justice, peace, and the integrity of creation, women religious, theologians and theological educators as spiritual leaders, spiritual directors, and spiritual companions, theologians and theological educators as women religious. The contributions these women religious made as theologians and scholars cannot be underestimated. They provided innovative scholarship across the theological disciplines for the church. They provided innovative scholarship across the theological disciplines for the academy, nationally, continentally, internationally, for Roman Catholic professional societies, for traditional Protestant professional societies, for secular professional societies. These women religious served in positions of institutional leadership in colleges, universities, as presidents and administrators. They served in positions of ecclesial leadership as consultants, board members, administrators. They served in positions of ecumenical leadership as consultants, board members, and administrators. And they served in positions of interreligious leadership as consultants, board members, and administrators. The contributions of women religious as theologians and institutional leaders also needs to be taken into consideration. They served in positions of institutional leadership as college, university, seminary, schools of theology, as their presidents, their deans, and their administrators. Women religious served in positions of ecclesial leadership as consultants, board members, administrators, for bishops' conferences, for theological commissions. Women religious served in positions of ecumenical leadership as consultants, board members, and administrators, both locally, nationally, and internationally, for councils, commissions, and assemblies. And they served in positions of interreligious leadership as well. We continue with the contributions of women religious as theological educators, teaching and learning from other women and men across the lifespan and across cultures, educating and contributing to the formation of priests and seminarians in seminaries. Women religious were teaching and learning from those preparing for ordained and lay ministries in Catholic schools of theology. They were mentoring and learning from those completing licentiates and doctorates in ecclesiastical faculties. Women religious were mentoring and learning from students and colleagues at university divinity schools, denominational and non-denominational schools of theology, and various consortia. Women religious were exercising leadership and administration in the fields of accreditation and research on theological education. Additional contributions included how theologians and theological educators acted and responded as women religious. Women religious were teaching and learning from other women religious and men religious, formally and informally. And I can't stress enough the importance of the informal learning. Not everyone, well, to be an academic theologian, yes, you need a degree. But to think theologically and to have theological imagination, you need companions on the journey. Women religious served in positions of leadership in their respective congregations. And when we wonder, what happened to Sister so-and-so? She was writing and publishing and attending conferences. Well, if you scratch below the surface, she may have been elected to leadership. That lasted for many years. Women religious served in positions of leadership for the LCWR and for the Conference of Major Superiors of Women Religious. Women religious served in positions of leadership for intercontinental and international conferences and congresses on women religious and joint conferences of men and women religious. And they participated in interreligious encounters and dialogues with monastics from other religious traditions. So when you think about the trajectory of this, how women religious were essentially locked out of opportunities for theological study, and within a matter of a few decades, they are offering this kind of leadership. Additional contributions. Women religious as theologians and theological educators were also advocates for justice, for peace, and the integrity of creation. Women religious witnessing to the values of the gospel in situations of injustice, abuse, and violence. Women religious participating in advocacy groups and networks, and when needed, serving in positions of leadership. Women religious advocating for women and women's voices in intercontinental and international conferences. And the contributions made by women religious, theologians, and theological educators as spiritual leaders, spiritual directors, and spiritual companions in as many ways as there are desires and needs, locally and globally. So, I will pour out my spirit, and your daughters shall prophesy. Recognizing the daughters who prophesy today in the United States and around the world, some of whom are also in this room. In 2022, there were reportedly fewer than 4,200 nuns in America, which is 76% decline over 50 years. At the rate sisters are disappearing in the United States, one estimate said that there will be fewer than 1,000 nuns left in the United States by 2042. However, one of my colleagues, a church historian, reminds us that this is not a phenomenon that we have not seen before in the life of the church. But we may just have to wait. What crisis, what challenge, what gift of the Holy Spirit might, in a way, spontaneously lead to the foundation of new communities of women of women religious. Hopefully, some of them will be theologians and theological educators who carry forward the legacy of those who have gone before them. I'd like to say a word myself on my own trajectory, my own story in theological education and commitment to theological study. And I have to say, as a lay missioner in Brazil, that is really where I received my informal theological education. I had an advantage to be in the company of Leonardo Boff every weekend as I traveled from Rio de Janeiro to Petropolis to spend the weekend with one of my American sisters, who was one of the leaders for the Franciscan Pastoral Institute in Petropolis. I have to say, I hadn't read any of his books. I wasn't quite able to read Portuguese at the time, but he was a wonderful volleyball player, and that was my initial experience in table conversations and my poor Portuguese. But as my linguistic abilities increased, I realized the gift that his theology was to the Franciscan family and to the church at large. And even as his departure from the Franciscan order, although I believe he still has a Franciscan heart, his books and his writings still continued to be timely and responding to the questions of the day. But upon my return, I think one of the things that moved me most was the tragic deaths, martyrdoms, if you will, of the 4 women in El Salvador. I think this also challenged many women religious to not only think more seriously about the risks of prophecy in our world and in our church, but also challenged us in many ways to see that we were truly part of a world church. Insufficient reflection had been done on the missionary movement of the late 1950s and early 60s. But I think there's a way in which Roman Catholic women religious began to reflect theologically on the significance of the world church and their participation in it. My appeal to women religious in positions of elected leadership, and if some of you are watching, I encourage you to pay attention to this appeal, is the work, if you're doing leadership or the work of religious formation, to recognize the qualities necessary for graduate theological studies, research and teaching and mentoring, to reaffirm that investing in the graduate theological education of women religious is of critical importance for religious life, the church, the society, and the academy. Regardless of the future the congregation may envision for a member, dare to reimagine, as your sisters before you did, alternative possibilities that advanced studies in theology might serve in the short term and the long term. As you think about all of those contributions that I identified, it was precisely because of experience meeting theological study, theological reflection, and theological education that those contributions were possible. And fourth, remember that women religious share a responsibility for stewarding the gifts we have received for the sake of the people of God and for the unfolding future of theological education. We may be few, but we're still mighty in many ways in terms of our influence. And our sisters from Africa, from Asia, from Eastern Europe, from the Caribbean, from all the regions of the world, we share with them this trajectory of theological formation, theological education. In many parts of the world, sisters still do not have access, are denied access to seminary formation. Now, whether or not they should be in the seminary is a question local bishops need to resolve. However, that they should have access to quality theological education and formation is a moral requirement at this point in time in the life of the church. When I ask that question, what should women religious be paying attention to today? That wasn't meant to be a rhetorical question in any way. But I think we probably answered it locally in our situatedness. I want you to think seriously about the women religious around our world. We can see the contributions that women religious made here in the United States. However, we need to recognize that those same contributions will be made, are being made by women in other contexts who only recently have had access to theological training and education. And so, a word of encouragement to sisters who experience a call to the vocation of theologian and theological educator. Make a way, even if it seems that there is no way. Sisters before you have found a way. You can find a way as well. And so to conclude, I will pour out my spirit, and your daughters shall prophesy. The end of the presentation, but not of the Q&A. Floor is open. Maybe one question to get people going here would be to go back to what women religious who are theologians and theological educators need to be paying attention to, and the reasons why. So maybe we could just spend a few minutes on that question one more time. You can talk among yourselves. Maybe with a different partner this time. All right, I'd like to call you back. And invite some questions. I've been informed that there's an online question.
Yes, we can start with an online question. Let me pull it up. Sister Meg, for those of us who have been inspired and educated by women religious, but are not ourselves women religious, what is a way that we can continue on your prophetic legacy and charism?
That's a wonderful question, and I think it's a very important one. Some people may have asked, why did I focus only on women religious? And I think the reason is the statistics sort of signify why it's important for us to remember women religious right now. And I think there are really countless ways of carrying on a legacy that is a shared legacy. And really one of the points that I was hoping to make in this when I talked about contributions and the origin of the word contribution. that we're giving something or granting something and we're doing it together. And so the fact that women religious have done it together, I think really for decades, if not centuries, we have done it together with other lay women, lay men, men religious, with clergy, with bishops. There's been a doing and a being together, perhaps not pervasive, but even if it's been done in exceptional ways or episodic ways, we have a legacy there to preserve. So I think the legacy continues because the legacy is also a gift of the Spirit. And however that gift of the Spirit is poured out, however it is received, I think it's not only a testimony to the people that have gone before who have given over the legacy, but accepting the legacy, receiving the legacy, and stewarding it, not because it was the work of women religious, but because it's the work of the Spirit. And how do we share in an ongoing way in that work of the Spirit?
If folks in the room have a question, feel free to raise your hand.
Women religious, in the United States, that's such a huge influence on education and hospitals and other works of compassion and mercy. And today, there are huge communities now, institutional communities, that are in need of leadership from traditional churches. And I'm thinking of incarcerated women, law enforcement, military life, where the church has less and less of a foothold. And women religious had an incredible knack in the 18th and 19th centuries to get into these communities of immigrants and African Americans and Native Americans, marginalized populations, to serve on behalf of the church. And what would be the possibility for women religious and theological education to conscientize our church so that people that are marginated today can receive that same kind of service and devotion?
Well, I think one way of responding is looking to the variety of expressions of women religious in the United States today, if we're talking about the United States. In one of my slides, maybe I can go back to it. Or maybe I passed it. This slide, for me, is very critical. Because today, in terms of the lives of women religious, it's in this sector here of the Council of Major Superiors of Women Religious and the communities that are affiliated with the CMSWR that have many new members and members who are actively engaged in some of the ministries of which you speak. I think we're at a point in the history of religious life, of women's religious life here in the United States, where whatever the realities and reasons were for the divisions that occurred, they were profoundly theological reasons. They weren't just political reasons. And some of the reasons were driven by charism, but I'd like to say that they were ecclesiastical and ecclesial reasons as well as theological reasons. And perhaps as we look at the needs and the demands, the necessities of the world today, we also need to recognize the giftedness of a variety of expressions of religious life that continue right now among younger women religious in a number of these newer communities that have emerged, and to recognize how our legacies may converge precisely in these ministries to people who are on the peripheries, to people who are on the margins. It's still a difficult thing for, I think, communities to reconcile, because there remains so much hurt in terms of histories that, well, eventually this hurt will pass away as the sisters themselves pass away. But I think the ministries themselves and the ministries of need, there's one way that I propose we might be able to go. A number of communities are reaching the point of what is called completion. But they won't, their resources will outlive them. So the question is, how can these resources that outlive communities moving toward completion be invested in some of the ecclesial movements and new communities that are emerging, I think, really moved by the Spirit to address the needs, just as those foundresses that I identified, let's take Mother Cabrini for an example, that were responding to immediate, urgent needs. Ecclesial movements and new communities right now are doing that. Internationally speaking, yes, religious life continues to flourish in Asia and in Africa and in parts of Latin America. But right now in the Latin American context, as I understand it, at least from Brazil, ecclesial movements and new communities are where young women who previously would have entered a religious community are moving in the direction of ecclesial movements and new communities. So rather than say, we don't have anything to do with that, maybe we need to say and pay attention and investigate and inquire and say, what really is going on in these movements and new communities, some of which actually share our foundational charisms, especially for Franciscans.
All right,
Other
we have
question?
another question from the Zoom audience.
Hello.
I began my studies in theology at BC, and after years of teaching in Catholic schools, pursued a PhD in education. Today, in light of many choices by the U.S. hierarchy, for example, labor relations with Catholic school teachers, the treatment of LGBTQ teachers, staff, and families, advocacy for vouchers without addressing wider equity concerns in public schooling, I often wonder about the relationship between theology and empirical research. What relationship do you see between theology and empirical research, and does the history of women religious educators inform our understanding of this relationship?
Well, in terms of empirical research, I think the realities of educational ministries within the life of the church have been dramatically changed. And part of that change has been the loss of women religious in those institutions, especially what we might say almost the collapse of the parochial school system and as we see more consolidations of high schools, a similar trajectory going on. And what we see now, too, is colleges that had been established by women religious have either merged or have gone out of existence. So in terms of empirical research, the connection that I would see would be theological thinking offers us the opportunity to ask the question why, to look at the situation historically. But the other thing that I think theological inquiry allows us to do is to recognize the limits under which the church is operating, but also to consider what the possibilities are in terms of what the church, and when I'm speaking of church, I'm talking about church leadership as well as church membership. When we think of questions of justice with regard to salaries, when we think of questions of justice with regard to who can be hired and who can remain in a position, those are questions that I think require theological inquiry, but they also require inquiry on the part of the larger church community, on the part of church membership. And how women religious figure into this at this moment in time, there are right now just a handful of us, as I think of the Boston College situation right now. I think we're 5 or 6 women religious in one of the largest Catholic universities in the United States. And I believe of those that are full-time, I'm the youngest one. So in terms of theological education, I mean, I don't intend to age out too soon, but the reality is there. And so on the one hand, we need to figure out what kind of research do we need to appropriately answer our questions, and also recognize that women religious who are theologians, who are ethicists, who are canon lawyers, have been writing about these questions and answering these questions for several years. So it's not as though the questions haven't been raised and answers haven't been sought. Those voices, in some cases, have been silenced. Or there's a way in which the work that was done was seen as work that was for a moment in time that perhaps needs to be looked at once again for a new interpretation and a reappropriation.
Okay, we have time for one last question. We'll take it from our online audience.
All right, so I think this will be a good question to have us thinking, forward towards the future. We can name so many prolific women religious theologians, Schneiders, Johnson, Farley, to name a few. Are you aware of emerging sister theologians and who they are and what can be done to encourage and support them?
Open up tenure track positions. That would be one way. I would say to do targeted searches for women religious and to identify them. I think one of the realities that we face is that even those that are theologically educated run the risk of being called forward to leadership in their own religious communities. And so, I mean, I would like to thank my own sisters, some of whom are watching, for their generosity of spirit to mission me back to the STM at our last general chapter. because it's a difficult discernment. I mean, some sisters have been able to say, leadership isn't my thing, whatever. But leadership is all of our thing in terms of the future and the mission of our respective congregations. And to know the sacrifices that my own sisters have made so that I could be here teaching all of you are very significant, especially at this time when numbers of our sisters are in need of assistance and are making their journey home to God. It is very, very demanding. And there's a way in which I really am in a very privileged position to be able to be here, because I know it's due to their willingness, their generosity of spirit, and their really love for me, but also love for the church and love for this ministry of theological education, of which they too have been recipients over time.
Please join me in thanking Sister Guider.